Hello everyone, welcome to the Humanitarian Leadership Academy webinar series, Humanitarian Careers, Leadership in Emergency Settings. It's an absolute pleasure to welcome you here today for this learning and discussion space. While you're joining us, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, letting us know your name, your organisation if you like, and where you're joining us from. It's always a pleasure to engage with people in this space from all over the world. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome two incredible panellists to our session today who are going to inform and inspire us through their shared presentation. So I'm delighted to welcome Thomas Hill, who is Country Director for Nigeria for the Norwegian Refugee Council, and Gita Modgil, Senior Humanitarian Aid Director, who's independent. Thomas Hill has 24 years of experience working in the sector, including 17 years at senior level. And he's based in Abuja. And Gita Modgil holds almost 2 decades of experience in leadership and project management, focusing on the Middle East. So a huge thank you and welcome to Thomas and Gita today. And thank you to everyone joining us for this session. It's great to see people introducing themselves in the chat. Thank you so much for being here for this session. Lovely to see, the lovely spread of countries. Welcome to Teneng from Cameroon, Adama from Mali, Al-Haji from Northeast Nigeria, Elizabeth Pennington in England, but was recently working in South Sudan, Aicha from Mozambique. So welcome to all of you. It's brilliant to see people dialing in from all over the world for this session, which has proven to be very, very popular. All of you are so keen to hear the insights from Gita and Thomas today. So yeah, I can see that we have over 100 people in the virtual room with us already. So thank you once again for joining us. So I'll take you through a few introductory slides before handing over to Gita and Thomas for their presentation. So I'm Carmen Parkinson and I'm your host for today's session. I'm Communications and Marketing Advisor here at the HLA, and I'm based near Manchester in the UK. At the HLA, our mission is to strengthen people's skills and capabilities through learning, working with people in the humanitarian sector and beyond to prepare for and respond to crises. So we're a sector-facing team within Save the Children, with a presence in the UK and 6 regional centres around the world, delivering in-person and blended capacity strengthening initiatives. 2 more slides from me before you hear from Thomas and Gita. So a quick agenda. So this is the 3rd session in our Humanitarian Careers series. So we kick-started this series back in Feb with a session on WASH, water, sanitation and hygiene. And then this was followed in May with a double bill focusing on communications and peace building. So they were really insightful and inspiring sessions as well. So if you missed those, you can catch those recordings on our YouTube channel. So today we're zooming in on the field of leadership, specifically of leading in emergency contexts. And this is where Gita and Thomas will share all of their expertise and insights with us. So they'll be sharing their personal career journeys into the sector. They'll be highlighting different stages of a humanitarian response, highlighting the key skills needed at each stage. And then they'll be sharing their advice for you, for people who are aspiring to working towards leadership roles or developing in leadership roles, no matter which stage of your career journey that you are on. So after this presentation, we'll have a panel discussion. So please use the Zoom Q&A function to submit your questions as we go along. And then finally from me, just a few quick housekeeping points. This webinar is being recorded, so a link and slide deck will be available within the next 24 hours. So keep an eye on your inbox for that email. As I've mentioned, please use the Q&A function to type your questions for Thomas and Gita. which will for our discussion at the end. And you're very welcome to and encouraged to use the chat function for any reflections or reactions as we go along. And just as a kind reminder, please keep any questions and comments respectful and on topic. I know there's so much we all want to ask Thomas and Gita today, drawing on their decades of experience working in different contexts, but please keep the questions and comments relevant to humanitarian careers and professional development. So thanks for your cooperation on that. And then for accessibility, Zoom captions are enabled, so you can turn those on and translated options are available. So click on more and you'll be able to activate those. And I can see that Medina has asked in the chat, so this answers your question, in the Q&A. An HPAS badge is available for all live webinar attendees. So you'll be able to claim that in recognition of your learning and engagement in this discussion forum today. So that's all from me. So I'll now hand you over to Gita. Thank you, Gita.
Hi, everyone. Come on. Thank you so much for that introduction. Hi, Thomas. Hi, everyone else that's joined us today. I hope it ends up being an extremely fruitful discussion. And part of what we were talking about today before everybody came on board was we hope that this will be a safe and inclusive space. So it's more of a conversation. Thomas and I, sharing some of the things that we have learned across the many, many years that we've been working in this industry. So we do hope that it's helpful to people on this call. So a little bit about me. I was born in India. I studied psychology and sociology. I decided that I wanted to be in the creative world. And so I basically joined film, television, and radio. And I was using that medium to basically speak about local governance issues. I was a drive time radio DJ at that point in time. So along with speaking about local governance and, the latest Bollywood news, I was also playing music. And this was when I was about 24 years old. And then I met the love of my life, as some of us do. We got married. I moved to Palestine. And it's that point that I started using the skills that I had learned over this period, which was communications, to work in conflict transformation and peace building. So I started working for a peace building radio station. I also was an editor for the first independent Palestinian news agency. And then the tsunami struck, and I was able to then parlay those communication skills to actually join Catholic Relief Services in Aceh, Indonesia. And use those skills to advocate for communities, to be able to put the work and information about the work that we were doing in Aceh, which was extremely important at that point in time. And it was an unprecedented crisis when it first struck in terms of its scope and magnitude. And be able to kind of use those skills to write, to communicate, videos, audio, all of that stuff. And it was kind of at that point that I realized that everybody around me, and Thomas will speak about this a little bit as well, everybody around me had kind of started this career because this is what they wanted to do pretty much since the day they were born. And while for me, I fell into it to a certain degree, right? So I had these skills, I figured out I could use these skills, I was passionate about this work, I believed in it, and there was a lot of it that aligned with my value system. And so I was like, okay, so I want to go ahead in this, and this is what I want to do. I want to make this my career. So how do I do that? So at that point in time, and I was close to 30 then, I went and I did a master's in humanitarian action in Europe, an Erasmus Mundus program. And it was incredible. I was the oldest person in class, and it was a bit embarrassing when I first entered. I'm like, oh, oops. But I think what I brought to the class was the practical knowledge that a lot of the kids didn't have at that point in time. So it was a good balance. But since then, I've been, other than Aceh, Indonesia, I've been part of multiple emergencies in various roles, whether it's communications, monitoring and evaluation, project management, area manager, leader, first responder, whether it's been the Beirut blast, whether it's been, post the earthquake in Northwest Syria, multiple incursions in Gaza, the earthquake in Jakarta, so on and so forth. And I think, this is all to say that it is possible to switch midway. You don't have to start in this line of work to be vested in it. You can start with something else. And you can then realize when you're a little bit much older, actually, that, okay, maybe I want to do this because it aligns with my values, because I believe in it, because I'm passionate about it. And that's pretty much what I did. And yes, as a woman, especially as a woman of color in the beginning, things were challenging. It's not that easy because this field, at least when I started out 2 decades ago, was very dominated by the emergency cowboys, who generally were, men who were white. And Thomas, this is not about you, but I'm just saying, like, and generally they were. And I think coming in as a woman was definitely challenging at that point in time. But since then, I've seen so much growth in the industry. I mean, agencies are now supporting their structures, their processes, their systems want female leaders, and they're encouraging that. So this is all to say it's possible, it's doable, and if this is the shift that you want to make, it's something that's extremely feasible. So that's a little bit about me.
Yeah, thanks, Gita. Yeah, my story is a little bit different, and like when Gita said, I've been involved with this for many, many years. I did have hair when I started. So in college, when I'm born and raised in California, from the United States. I grew up and went to school in California, and I studied literature with a focus on poetry. My plan had been to be a university teacher, and so in order to help move towards a PhD, I joined a program the United States government has called Peace Corps, sends volunteers abroad for a couple of years, and I had wanted to firm up my second language, which is Russian. So I went to Russia, and I found out that teaching is like super hard, right? And I was not very good at it at all. So my whole life I had thought I was going to do one thing, and then when I actually got out to try it, I found out yeah, maybe not. So what I did find, though, is I was working with local community-based organizations while I was there, getting small grants, helping them with projects, and I really enjoyed that. And I found out that can be an entire career. So when I came home, I studied management a bit, and I really kept my sights focused on getting back to an international role. And then eventually I did, and it was, I had lined myself up in different ways to be able to go into an expat position. But in the end, it was really about my network, right? I got my first job back in Moscow based on someone who had been in my Peace Corps group to help me out. And so in Moscow, I was working on education and training programs, and then there was a conflict in the North Caucasus, and through various connections, I transitioned there to Chechnya, which was my first humanitarian role. Next slide, please. Yeah, and then since then, I've worked on conflicts and protracted crisis for the most part in a lot of different places, but heavy focus on Russia. I've worked in Ukraine, Georgia, and the South Caucasus, in Palestine for many years, which is where Gita and I met. I worked on the Syria conflict, and now I'm based in Nigeria, although today I'm on vacation at home visiting my parents. Throughout my career as well, one thing I really enjoyed is that I've repatriated back home a few times. And I had different experiences here in the US as well. So I worked in refugee resettlement in the United States. And I also worked with the American Red Cross on emergency and disaster management in the Los Angeles region. And then that tied into their international response in Ukraine as well. So kind of gone back and forth between protracted crisis, a bit of emergency stuff, domestic, international, and put it all together into kind of a weird career. Some unconventional choices my wife and I have made along the way, but it's been, yeah, really enjoyable. I think for me, being of service is the core to happiness, right? And being happy is purpose for life. So, but yeah, now at this point, I like to spend a lot of time talking about leadership, coaching, and mentoring. So thanks for the invite to discuss here. And there's a lot of participants, so thank you for joining from all over the world. Really cool. Yeah. Please. Next slide. Gita, you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. So part of, when I went back to school, and part of what you always read when you read about emergency response is that it's linear, that it follows a certain trajectory. You have the threat, you have the response, then you have the deployment, and then it basically ends in recovery, and it shouldn't last more than a year. Come on, next slide, please. Thank you. But in reality, what ends up happening, and this is part of what Thomas was just speaking about, right? I mean, your career in this line of work, you can be in an emergency and you think you're moving into recovery, but then there's another shock, there's another crisis, and then you go back to emergency again. And this kind of cyclical reaction has almost become the norm as opposed to something that happens not that often. I mean, the number of protracted crises that I have worked on, similar to Thomas, has been increasing exponentially in the past decade. And each one of these stages does require different skills and leadership, needs. So that's something that we'll be touching upon in kind of the slides today and the discussion and the direction that we take. Next slide, please. So this was something that, we thought was funny, a little palate cleanser in the middle of the presentation. So people, and I'm sure Thomas gets this as well, and you guys probably do, because I see a lot of you, on the chat when you're writing in, are also practitioners. So when you try and explain to people what you do, especially people back home in India who are like in the creative world, I tell them I'm an aid worker, and they think I'm a little bit like Superwoman. I try to find a female-centric meme here, but I couldn't. So they think I'm Superwoman, but I'm not. I mean, I am in other areas of my life. And maybe sometimes in this one too, like all of us are. A lot of the work that we end up doing the day-to-day, especially when you get into a protracted crisis, tends to become a desk job. And that's kind of part of what we will talk about as well. So there is kind of this magical realism of what you think it's going to be, and then what it actually sometimes ends up being is like very different. And it also depends on where you catch it within the cycle, whether you catch it in the deployment phase, whether you catch it as a first responder right in like the immediate response stage, or whether you're moving it and catching it in the protracted kind of recovery phase. Next slide, please. Thomas, do you want to pick on this a bit, and then I can kind of add in?
Yeah, thanks, Gita. It's a good segue. I think from the meme, what's interesting is that like each of those little points, right? Representation, standing up in front of a crowd, managing an ongoing emergency, like those things happen, as part of a general career. And those are sometimes like the most special moments in your career as well. But yeah, I mean, at the leadership level, like often my job is about meetings and email, right? So that's pretty normal, I think, for a lot of leaders. But when we do look overall, what Gita was touching on is the full emergency sort of cycle of a crisis. For a long time, there was a linear view, and a lot of different agencies look at it differently now. There's always an immediate response component to whatever their model might be, right? Like one that I refer to quite frequently is the chronic and acute. A lot of places have a chronic issue. Yeah, a lot of places where you might work have a chronic problem. Then on top of that, there are a lot of acute spikes and emergencies that happen along the way. So you do have to be ready to deal with both, like entrenched issues. I noticed someone put in the chat, they're interested in poverty, for example, poverty alleviation. That is an entrenched chronic issue. And on top of that, you can have things like conflict, earthquake, et cetera, that can worsen the situation. And so in an immediate response, like those first few days, right, first 72 hours, that generally is going to be very local. And I think that is kind of the point where a lot of people are hoping to get involved. And, 95% of the world, it's a local Red Cross, local Red Crescent, local government agency, church, mosque, something that's doing a very local response, right? Which means that there are a lot of opportunities to get involved where you are at home right now. And that's how most people who move into an expatriate role tend to start, right? They'll start with a localized emergency and then maybe transition into a job with an NGO, or maybe they'll start with a junior role in protracted crisis, and then an acute thing will happen and they'll move around. But in any sense, it's generally not going to be the international community that's a first responder, right? And that is very much a local function. Where NGOs, in particular, international NGOs, are present, they may have done some of that thinking. They may have partnerships that help with some of that, particularly if it's a particularly tough context, or there's a lot of issues that happen, or people have been there a very long time. But in general, this is a space where if you're interested in, and you're a brand new person, brand new professional, interested in getting involved with humanitarian work, then volunteering locally or finding the local response agencies is kind of a key thing for you to do your research on. So, and it helps build up skills and credibility as well. Gita, any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, on this slide kind of speaks about it. Can I have the next slide, please? Thanks. So this slide kind of speaks a little bit about the skills that are actually needed in kind of the immediate response, first responder stage. Most of these, like Thomas was saying, is definitely localized. I mean, I was there just a couple of months ago in Turkey when the earthquake took place recently. And I mean, there really wasn't a lot that I could have done at that point in time because it was the local, Turkish kind of Red Crescent that responded. It was the communities, it was the civil society organizations. And I was more as a bystander. As much as I wanted to help, I wasn't necessarily asked to help because they knew what they were doing. They had their system set up. So I think there are many opportunities for you as a person that's living in a country that wants to join this line of work to start supporting, to start helping. Some of the skills that they usually tend to look for, are listed here. I'm not going to read it out. You can read it yourself. But I think the one element that is cross-cutting across all of this, across all these skills, is local knowledge and cultural sensitivity. And you have that, right? You're there already. You know the context, you know the country, you know your people. You don't need somebody like me coming in and telling you, let's do it this way as a first responder. So you have a huge advantage to kind of utilize that opportunity to help your community. So like Thomas was saying, becoming a volunteer, listing with, your local Red Cross, Red Crescent chapter, undergoing trainings, continuous training, because first aid trainings, just because you do it once doesn't mean they're going to call upon you if you haven't refreshed that training. And another part of what Thomas was also saying is that agencies, when the international nonprofits come in, and if they come in with the UN or ASEAN or whoever it is, they will rely on your local knowledge to actually undertake the next stage of the response. So you do have an advantage there in terms of breaking into the sector. And it's also important to kind of do a little bit of your own education, right? Like, learn about the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, learn about those frameworks of the UN, learn about the ASEAN frameworks, the AHA Center, and so on and so forth. Build your knowledge so that you're aware and you're ready and you're present, especially if this is an arena that you feel passionately about and you want to join and make your career. Next slide, please. Thomas, do you want to start with this one?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and so within immediate response and how the systems work, right? There's multiple layers. You start with a localized response, and there's going to be one system, and then there's an international layer on top of that that can come to assist when emergencies or disasters are of significant scale. Usually when local capacity is overwhelmed. So Turkish Red Crescent's a great example. Hugely advanced national society. They can handle quite a lot of activity. When Syrian refugees came into the country in huge numbers, they needed support from the rest of the planet, basically. So that's in the short term. You'll see this movement of people, personnel, resources from all across the globe, and each of that is coordinated by specific systems, right? Like we have a UN-led response, for example, that a lot of INGOs will engage with, and then there's a Red Cross, Red Crescent response, and then there's government responses, city to city as well. And this is kind of the deployment areas where a lot of people, like you'll see in movies, it's like the exciting part. People get their bag and they get in there. But generally those are going to be people who have really highly specialized skills, right? Something that is not available locally, like, crisis communications, for example. Let's say this organization that needs help, like their communications team has been displaced. Yeah, because the localized team is also impacted by the disaster, right? If you bring someone in from the outside to help, or the work is so huge and so overwhelming that you need help from the rest of your agency. And so to get to this point where you're a person who's being deployed means that you have already gone through some of the localized effort, you've built up a network and a career to an extent where your skills are valuable in that moment. So you're generally not going to start at the deployment stage, right? You're going to start locally and build towards that. Whereas a lot of people come in and that's what they want to do immediately. But yeah, it takes some time to build into that. So yeah, and then in terms of who's being deployed, I mean, as Gita mentioned, like a lot of time for the last several decades, people have looked like me, right? Particularly even the style of facial hair comes about, kind of weird. And so that has changed quite a bit. Like when I was working with IFRC in Moldova, for example, most of my delegates were from other countries. They're half women, half men. Like there was an intentional effort to reach out to various places. And you see that with NGO leadership as well. And you see that with rosters that are going up, heavy focus on local skills, local languages, local contextual knowledge, where possible, right? And then you are going to have one area in particular that is somewhat different is that local systems have their own language. International systems have their own language as well. So someone who knows how the international system operates may not know how the localized system operates. And so those are also skills that you'll see being pulled in to help on humanitarian coordination. So, yeah. Gita, please.
Sure. And I think, Thomas touched upon a lot of it. So again, I'm not going to, next slide, please. Thank you. So I'm not going to kind of read the list out that's on the slide, but some of the things these are highly, highly specialized areas when you actually touch upon deployment. So crisis communication was mentioned, technical specialities. So if you are an engineer in water systems, you already have a leg up because this is a skill that is very, very much in demand. If you are an engineer, a civil engineer, again, a skill that's very, very much in demand. One of the things that Thomas touched upon was coordination, kind of the difference between, the national and the international systems that we currently work under. So coordination is another very, very specific skill. This is something, of course, you can build over time, as I have, as Thomas has. It's not something that's extremely deep or complicated, but it does require time and energy. You have to do it repeatedly, start at a lower position, then kind of go up and, up the ladder. So all of those things, all of these elements take time and energy in terms of investment. But if you have a technical specialty that you already have, that's present because of your existing education, you have a leg up. One of the things that I do want to touch upon is in the deployment stage, a key skill that a lot of people tend to forget is flexibility and ambiguity. You have to be comfortable with staying in group housing, in tents, in situations where you are not going to get a hot meal, where you have to share one toilet with 20 men and 3 women, where there are diseases and there are mosquitoes, and it's things that you probably don't necessarily face in your current 4 walls in your home. You may or may not, but over there it's just much, much more. In any response, I remember in Aceh after the tsunami, it was group housing and it was challenging. It's challenging. It's different personalities. You're all under a lot of pressure. People are working like 16-hour days. You haven't had sleep. Your temper's frayed. There's one toilet. Somebody doesn't put the lid down. It's just simple things, but you have to have that kind of wherewithal to be able to deal with that level of kind of flexibility, the need to be ambiguous, because you don't have all the answers and you will not have all the answers. You're not going to have some prepared needs assessment where okay, this is exactly where I need to go. This is what my program design needs to be. This is the support I need to provide. And these are the community members, and I have the list. It doesn't always happen that way. Most often than not, it doesn't actually happen that way. So those 2 are key skills that I would kind of put over and above everything else, is your ability to be flexible and your ability to be ambiguous. Thomas, anything to add to this? Did I?
No, yeah, very well said.
Okay.
Yeah, also going to note it's sometimes going to be way too hot or way too cold for you.
Yeah.
But yeah, please. Also notice we're moving through time, so let's push through these so people can ask questions.
Yeah.
Oops, hang on. So recovery and protracted crisis. So yeah, we've talked a lot about the emergency, right? But protracted crisis, this is where most people build careers, because things are around for a long time. Palestine's a great example. Both Gita and I worked there. I worked with people who had 30 years of experience locally, right? Amazing humanitarian professionals who've been working in a crisis that's been going on for a very long time. And so this is the area where you will engage. I think what's challenging for some people is that this gets mixed up with immediate response frequently, because it is happening on top of protracted crisis. and people assume they're also the same, whereas they're going to need different skills and different leadership styles. Next slide, please. Yeah, Gita, you want me to take this? You want to? Yeah, so I mean, again, just there's a broad spectrum of jobs in a protracted crisis. Ongoing basic aid, you're going to have to be able to deal with acute situations, but also transition is frequent, right? These are long-term challenges. It's not uncommon for people to get burnt out or decide to change their positions every 12 to 36 months or so. And there's a lot of organizations do similar work in similar places and kind of similar prices all over the world. So there's a lot of career mobility, which is attractive to people, but can also be very challenging, mentally and emotionally, because you're going from deeply entrenched problem to deeply entrenched problem. But yeah, this is where most of the jobs are. So if you do want to have a long-term career, you should look towards this area, right? Like there's a lot of opportunity to build a professional career in this. And leadership in this area, as opposed to leadership in an immediate emergency, really has to focus out on holistic challenges, right? Look at the whole picture, focus on systems and large issues, as opposed to immediate response, which tends to be more top down based on incident command type approaches. So, yeah, Gita?
Yeah. Next slide, please. Thank you. And I think, part of what Thomas and I have spoken about so far, there are commonalities between each of these kind of stages of the life cycle of an emergency. Good leadership, I mean, you need it at deployment, you need it at immediate response, you definitely need it at protracted crisis and recovery. And I think it's important to remember humility and compassion in that, because you are a guest. If you are not a first responder or an emergency responder in your own country, you are a guest. So humility is extremely important. Cultural sensitivity, understanding the local context. I think other commonalities is, definitely along the lines of, emergency management does tend to be top down. And if that's not a structure you're comfortable with, then this could be challenging for you as an area of work. Because it is directive, you have very little time, you need to move, and you just need to be okay with that. I mean, things change a little bit when you go into a protracted crisis because it becomes more regular in that sense, in terms of regular programming, this is happening. So it's not potentially as directive, but up until that stage, it tends to be extremely top down. I would say those would be the two kind of key commonalities that I want to speak about right now. Thomas, anything to add to this, or can we jump to the next three slides? Yeah, great. Next one, please. Thank you. So early career. This is something we touched upon. Again, volunteering, internships, being part of the conversation, continuous training, all of these elements are extremely important for you to gain credibility. And this was a question that actually somebody had put in the chat. What do we mean by credibility? And that's what we mean, is that if you want to have a seat at the table and you want to be part of the process, you need to make sure you have something to add. Because the last thing an agency is going to want is to hire someone who doesn't know what they're doing. These are, high kind of stress environments where you need professionals who have a background, who have knowledge, who have understanding. And I think, part of what Thomas also touched upon earlier is, you can sit there and apply for jobs ad nauseum. You can apply for 500 jobs, but most of the times your hit rate's not going to be that high. The best way to kind of get into the sector is to build your credibility and then network. So volunteering is a great way to build your network. Interning is a great way to build your network. Offering your services for free, especially if you're a recent graduate, is a great way to go about it. I mean, I have been in a position where people on my team started out as volunteers and then became officers and coordinators and managers, and now are at the top of their game in this line of work. And again, something that we spoke about earlier is you cannot, not that you cannot, but it is definitely challenging to jump to an expat position right off the bat. I think having that local expertise and local knowledge and and grounding yourself in your own country as a start to use it as your building block is extremely important, and will kind of help you be able to speak knowledgeably about what works and what actually doesn't. That practical experience is extremely important. Next slide, please. Thomas, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, and I think some of those key aspects, you know, of a career development apply for mid-career transition as well. Again, the network part is key. Meeting people, talking to people, getting mentors, you know, discovering things that can help you open doors, really, particularly in the NGO world, maybe less so if you're looking at like working for a donor office or, you know, more formalized type locations, but the NGO world is very much driven by personalities and networks and having connections. So yeah, but yeah, mid-career professionals, like people will frequently say, how do I move from working in, you know, what Gita was doing into an NGO, for example? A lot of valuable skills. You have to know how to market those. So it's a question of understanding our industry and saying, okay, my skill fits in over here, right? And fortunately, a lot of humanitarian response has a lot of frameworks you can look at. So you can pull up, you know, here's the core competencies required to work in whatever NGO. Here's where I fit. And then you can start asking people what kind of jobs need those skills. What are they called? Just find the names, you know, and look at those opportunities. But you have a bit of a different challenge, right? And a lot of people come in mid-career hoping to completely change what they're doing, like go from being, you know, I don't know, a stockbroker to being a teacher, for example. And while you can kind of make that transition into being, you know, from the private sector into leading education programs, it's much easier and quicker if you take your actual skills and transition to an area where they're directly applicable. Some people don't want to do it. Like you're sick of this, you want to move into something new, and that's fair. But then you have to ask yourself how long you want to spend on your transition. And then usually volunteering is going to be a quicker option. If you want to go from like, you know, instead of moving into a finance role from your corporate finance job, if you want to move into education programming, then you have to learn education programming. It'll take you longer. So yeah, really, if you want to transition, take the skills you have, move them over, find people doing the job you want to do, talk to them about it.
Yeah. And I think, Thomas, just to kind of add to that, that if you do want to switch, you have to be okay with starting lower. Right? So you're not going to start where you are right now. I mean, when I was doing what I was doing in radio and, you know, film and television, I was at a much higher level in my career ladder than when I started out in the nonprofit world. I mean, I started off volunteering. I mean, that was like my first two jobs. My first job was as a volunteer. For the second one, I got paid a nominal amount and had to take care of everything myself. So that is the pathway, and you just have to kind of accept that, especially if it's in an arena that's not completely in line with what is needed or what you're applying for, the direction you want to take, you have to be okay with starting lower. Next slide, please. So burnout. Thomas, do you want to start this one?
Sure. Thought this deserved a special slide. Just
it does. I absolutely think it does deserve a special slide. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's a global challenge for anyone who has to work, really, but the humanitarian world comes with some very specific challenges. Specifically noting where you start, people are looking at that immediate emergency deployment kind of thing where, you know, as Gita mentioned, you're working 16-hour days easily. Frequently that attitude will get transitioned into the longer term crisis as well, as you get people who are working on kind of normal challenges, right? 9-to-5 type jobs, but they're spending 16 hours, or you know, bringing that same attitude to it. Top-down command, incident reporting, you know, all these like sometimes very, very bureaucratic systems. And so burnout becomes really challenging, right? And it's something you have to think about when you're going into it or when you're transitioning to it. And it's something you really have to, my advice, I mean, at least, is to really get ahead of it and think about it and consider how you're going to manage it over the course of your career. I think it's pretty frequent for a lot of people that when you're younger and when you're earlier in your career, you're trying to get a break, like you tend to work more, and that's understandable. That's fine. That tends to be the case for most careers in any industry, right? As you sort of build out your career and as you have other priorities, maybe family or, whatever it might be, you have to start balancing. And so, a good rule of thumb is when you're coming into it, like I recommend to most people, try to work at 90% most of the time. And your 90% has to be really good and really effective to get ahead in the aid world. But there are going to be times, even in a long-term protracted crisis, where an acute situation is going to come up and you have to, even if your normal job is 9 to 5, there are going to be moments where you have to work 12-hour days for weeks and weeks and weeks. Again, you have to have something to allow you to move forward, even when things are hard. And yeah, and then you'll work with a lot of different organizations over the course of your career, or maybe not. Maybe you'll be one of those people who stays somewhere for 20 years. But every organization has problems. Yeah, no organization you can work for is perfect. A lot of people want to do humanitarian work because they think it's going to be this, soul satisfying thing all the time. And I mean, these are people. We're all people doing our best, and systems are built, and there are administrative and bureaucratic challenges. A lot of other challenges too. But anyway, finding a place that has problems you can deal with, I think, is really important. And keeping a perspective on that. Yeah, take your vacation, have a purpose, have a life outside your job. And the aid world is also really, really small. So don't be a jerk, right? It's key thing. Learn what your burnout signals are and get control of yourself before it happens. I've seen a lot of people, go down in flames because they needed a vacation and they wouldn't take it, right? And so they ended up burning everything behind them as they left. And again, I've come across people in multiple countries many times a decade later, so you will see people again and again. Gita, for example, 10 years ago, right? Here we are together on a podcast. So yeah, Gita, you want to add to
that? No, I mean, I think you've stated it really eloquently. Nothing to add. Next slide. There's Gita's advice. Next slide. Okay. My advice, not a guru. So I'm just kind of stating some of the things that I've learned along the way. I think it's important to know yourself and know that this is what you really want to do. You need to get into it for the right reasons. I meet a lot of people that kind of talk about, we want to get into it because we have heard that it pays really well, or that, there are lots of agencies here, and so it seems like a stable job. I mean, that's definitely one reason to get into it, but I think there has to be an alignment with your value system, because that will help you through the difficult times. Part of what Thomas was saying, not all agencies are perfect. Everyone has their issues, right? So kind of staying the course, knowing that you're here for a greater purpose is extremely important. Finding a mentor. Now, this is something that I did in the second half of my career. It's not something I recognized or realized would be beneficial to me in the first half of my career. And I can tell you there's a stark difference between having one and not having one. Find someone that you look up to, that you can learn from, because it's not always your line manager, right? Your line manager is not necessarily a person you can learn from. Maybe you can and you're lucky, but maybe you're not and you can't. So finding a mentor that you believe in, that will kind of coach you and guide you, is extremely important. And I remember with NRC, because NRC has a great mentorship program. And they actually ask you for specifics, like, what are you looking for? And I said, I'm looking for a female leader in the Middle East. And they connected me with a person who is still my mentor, even though I don't work for NRC right now. So finding a mentor is extremely important. Joining emergency rosters, that's another great way to get your foot in the door. So for example, if you are a technical specialist, you're currently working in a normal country program that is a development country program, putting your name on an emergency roster helps you get your foot in the door. Training, building knowledge, connections, this is something I've touched upon earlier. Nominating yourself for global initiatives. This is something that I've done consistently in my career, is so you have a seat at the table and people know you and recognize you. And this helps, again, going back to what Thomas was saying, building your network, which is extremely important in this line of work. Making yourself relevant and present, which connects to everything else, links to building credibility, and looking after your health mentally and physically. And that goes back to part of what Thomas was saying related to burnout. And this is something I learned the hard way, because I have had been at a point in my career where I did go through a burnout. So being able to recognize it, being able to look after yourself is extremely important, especially when you have a family with children. So those would be my little nuggets. Over to you, Thomas.
Thank you. Well said. Yeah, I mean, like everything, my advice is just maybe it's right, maybe it's not, who knows. But I do think that as a young professional or as a mid-career professional, if you're a leader, whatever it is, again, network, right? Meeting people, asking them, being genuinely interested in how they've built themselves out and what you can learn from them and how you can help each other, right? Like I spend a lot of time trying to help facilitate other people and trying to build connections, and because I enjoy it, but also because it's beneficial to my own career as well. So again, that's part of it. Build the network. And I think I wrote an article on LinkedIn. Like I do a lot of my writing on LinkedIn. I wrote an article about some of that with some practical suggestions, and I think she'll share that link as well, particularly around info interviews. I think are a really good way and approach to building a network. But for leadership in particular, public speaking, I think is an incredibly important skill. Like right now it's really early in the morning, so I'm not at my best, but being able to get up in front of an audience of 200 people, at 6 o'clock in the morning and just talk without being too scared is really important if you want to be a leader, right? I think and having to sit down next to a governor at a moment's notice and make a pitch, like these things will come up in the course of your career. I was just in Washington last week, had to talk to Senate Foreign Service Relations Committee, right? Foreign Relations Committee. I mean, there's these moments where you're going to be put in front of other leaders and you're going to have to be able to sell yourself. And so I think public speaking is important and a willingness to do that as well. But being genuinely interested in the lived experience of others, I think is a really important part of being a humanitarian leader. And over time, with the burnout and with the experience and the sort of problems that you'll deal with, a lot of people can shut that off. They try to protect themselves from some of the challenges that are out there. And what ends up happening is they also protect themselves from the good stuff that's out there. Again, maintaining a genuine interest in other people is going to be really important. It's something you have to nourish because it's very easy to withdraw over time. If you don't want to do that, then maybe leadership's not for you. And that's okay. But being able to tell your story and the story of the people that you serve, I think will always also be really important. And, a lot of people talk about AI and where that's going in terms of fundraising, communications, advocacy. Like there's a lot of great advantages that can come from using artificial intelligence, but being able to tell a good story, regardless of who you are or what you're doing, is always going to be important as well. My perspective anyway, particularly for leadership. So yeah, Dalai Lama said, if you want to help others, if you want others to be happy, practice compassion, right? If you want to be happy, practice compassion. So compassion, key skill. We'll leave you with that one word. Gita, any last thoughts?
No, thank you, Thomas.
All right, thank you.
Wow, Gita and Thomas, what can I say? What a session. So much ground covered. I'm sure that was a whistle-stop tour of like decades of accumulated experience and wisdom packed into such a brilliant session, so informative. And I can see what you're saying is really resonating with our audience members, with all the heart reactions, thumbs up to what you're saying. So that's brilliant. And it's great to see all of the audience members. Thank you for putting all your comments in the chat and just sort of sharing your thoughts to make this a really nice, lively and engaging learning and discussion space. So, wow, I'm going to leave my reflections to a minimum because I want to obviously maximise the amount of time for audience members to have their questions answered. So thank you to everyone who's put their questions in the Q&A. I'm going to try and get through as many as I can with Gita and Thomas in the time that we have. So we have until 1:30. So I'll try, like I say, I'll try and get through as many as possible. So I'd like to start off winding back to the start of the presentation when Gita was talking about her personal journey. So Gita, when you were talking about how you were a DJ and how you sort of transitioned into the sector. So somebody, anonymous, has said that she relates to what Gita said a lot. and considering making a switch at the age of 46. So she's wondering what she needs to consider in regards to age and also as the parent of a 10-year-old child. Gita, what are your thoughts on that, please?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the first element to consider would be your threshold for risk. What framework are you comfortable with? Which countries would you consider less risky or more risky? Would you be comfortable moving to Juba as opposed to working in Jerusalem? So I think that is a question you need to ask yourself and kind of do your research on first. Is schooling important? Is healthcare important? And where do you draw the line as a parent? So I think that would be that first kind of inner introspection that needs to be done. I think I don't know what your skill set is. I'm assuming you have, been a career professional in another area for the past several, years. And if that can be parlayed into being a nonprofit worker in the emergency world, and this is part of what Thomas and I were talking about, then, there are ways in which we can do it and it can be done. I'm happy if you want to reach out to me and connect on LinkedIn to kind of talk to you a little bit more, personally about, things that can be done to help and mobilize and move with your resume, your cover letter, the kind of jobs you should be applying for, the agencies you should be looking at, because there are some agencies that are more family friendly as compared to others. So happy to kind of talk you through that if you have additional questions, which I'm sure you do. So.
Thank you so much, Gita. Next, I'm going to move to a question from Timothy. Thanks, Timothy, for posting your question. And I'll put this one to Thomas to answer first, if he's happy to. So Timothy says, in light of the increasing number of global crises and the concurrent funding challenges faced by international NGOs, what strategies can seasoned professionals like myself, currently working with organisations like the UNHCR, employ to ensure our experience is recognised and our resumes stand out in a highly competitive job market? And additionally, how can we effectively navigate the realignment and downsizing trends to secure leadership positions in emergency settings within your organisation?
Sure, thanks. It's a deep couple of questions. We'll talk about that for quite a while. I think in terms of what is happening, like there is a lot of change in the industry, right? And there is a recognition for very good reasons that there needs to be more localization and more partnership-based activity, which ends up with, less field jobs for expats in particular. Yeah, I mean, that's challenging for people who have built a career on that, right? And I think in terms of where the future is going, look at how you can help with that transition is one. Being an advocate for partnerships, being an advocate for localization, and how you can bring that to the table and help empower local voices is really key for any leader. I focus a lot on that. I think when you're considering where your value added might be, there are also questions about, what level of benefits and pay you're willing to accept. Because I think if you really want to stay at a certain level, particularly with emergency management, then, going to sort of extreme locations where very few people are interested in going is obviously going to be more competitive, right? So it's much easier to get a job in parts of Sudan today than in Poland, right? That's a fact. That will always be a fact. And then also consider like what you can do at home, maybe are there things you could do as a repat instead of as an expat that can help build your career if you need to have an interim period. But yeah, in terms of transition, I mean, if you've got a really, nice P4, P5 position with UNHCR, like it's hard to to replace those benefits and pay, no matter where you're going. So it's going to be a challenge. And then what was the second part of the question? Sorry.
Yeah, sure. So Timothy asks, how can we effectively navigate the realignment and downsizing trends to secure leadership positions in emergency settings within your organisation?
Yeah, so within my organization, NRC, for example, a lot of the top leadership positions are hired internally, honestly. Like being an internal candidate is always a good thing, right? And I had previously worked for NRC as a head of programs and at different levels before becoming a country director. I came back to NRC after a sort of COVID experience back home as well. But I do think that NRC more and more is looking for leadership that's appropriate to context as one. And then depending on what kind of thing you're interested in doing, like, there are things like area manager, head of programs, positions that are slightly below a country director position, which are still leadership and still part of our country level leadership teams. And they're important roles and quite interesting as well. And I think that applies for most of the industry, and most NGOs are similar. Like unless there's a specific need to bring a skill from the outside, a lot of leadership positions will go internally everywhere. I don't know, Gita, any thoughts on that one?
Oh, sorry, Gita, you're on mute.
Yeah, Thomas, I mean, you're absolutely right. A lot of these positions are hired internally, especially when you're talking about leadership in an emergency setting. So we're not talking about technical positions or crisis communication. So, you want to become a project lead for an ongoing emergency, usually they come from the inside. I think, for me, some of the things that I spoke about earlier is relevancy, is continuous training, being open to learning, being curious, putting yourself out there, volunteering within your organization for things that are not necessarily part of your job description, but people recognize and realize you're a go-getter, you're ambitious, you want more, you're ready for more. Having conversations with your line manager and being like, okay, this is currently my job description and this is currently what I'm doing, but this is the direction I want to take. What things can I do to facilitate that? Can you connect me to global initiatives? Can I do a small tour of duty for 6 weeks in an emergency setting to build my profile and portfolio? I mean, those are all things that are feasible in your existing organizations. Those would be my recommendations.
Thank you so much to both of you for that. So we've got lots more questions coming in. So thank you again for everyone sharing their questions and their lovely comments as well. Nice feedback in the chat. People, Dramaine has said, panelists, this is very interesting and empowering. So that's really nice to hear. So I've got some questions around mentoring. Quite a lot of people are quite interested in the points that were made around that. So a few people have asked how they can secure a mentor, find one and secure one. Gita, could I put that one to you first?
Sure. So there are some organizations that have mentorship programs. Sometimes they're kind of hidden, like you don't necessarily hear about it in the countries that you're working in. They happen at HQ level. They're buried under HR processes. So sometimes it's just about asking because they actually exist, but you just don't know about it. Other times, organizations, while a lot of international organizations are moving in the direction of building leaders from within. So coaching and mentoring is becoming very much part of the framework of agencies. There are still several agencies that haven't gotten the memo, right? So in a situation like that, my recommendation would be to look at your peers, your colleagues, your managers around you, people that you have interacted with, ones that you are inspired by, that you're like, okay, there are things that this person does in a meeting or when he or she goes to the field, and I'm like, I wish I could do it that way. I wish I could learn. I wish I could model that kind of behavior. And, people are flattered to be asked to be a mentor. I mean, it's an ego thing sometimes as well. So I think it's just about going and putting yourself out there and being like, hey, there are some things that I want to learn from you on, and, would you be willing to coach me? And it doesn't necessarily have to be a set session like the way mentoring and coaching when it's super organized is. It's about having someone you can bounce ideas off. You can, if you're having a difficult situation with a coworker, you can go to this person and in confidence, in a safe space, be able to discuss it with them and get their feedback. Mentorship and coaching does not always have to be a very structured framework. It's about how you design it and develop it for yourself within the restrictions you have in the organization that you're working for.
Thanks so much, Gita. I just wanted to add as well, from the Humanitarian Leadership Academy, we have a couple of programs that we run. One is called AOMP, which is all across organizations mentoring program. And we also that offers matched between experienced practitioners and more sort of entry level. Yeah, so please, I'll send the link to that in the post-event email. And we also have a brilliant program called Women in Leadership as well that has mentoring opportunities. So again, I'll share the link in the post-event email with everyone so you can take a look and see if that's something for you. Thomas, is there anything you wanted to add as well to the mentorship questions?
Yeah, just a few random thoughts. There's a couple different things going on there. There's mentorship, which is generally going to be someone you click with really well and has a long-term, kind of connotation, right? And then oftentimes people will use that word when they mean people to help me get a job, and so I think I generally refer to those as career champions, right? You also need champions who might just be sort of second level connections who are like, oh, I get what you're trying to do. I can help you. Maybe you help me, and it's really, a lot of it's just about reaching out to people and asking and talking. And that's kind of what makes LinkedIn awesome, because it's really makes it much easier to find people and just reach out and say, hey, if you have 10 minutes, or if you don't mind sharing a few sentences via email, can you tell me how you achieved what you achieved? Yeah. And then what also frequently happens, and I would tell this for the group to consider as well, is that people will see those who are visible, like me and Gita, right? Because we're actively engaged in this conversation, for example. We are putting our leadership thoughts out there. And like, I get a lot of requests to be a mentor. Yeah, but where people actually really need to focus is on people doing exactly what they want to do with the organizations they want to work for. Like, I have ideas, but I can't help, like, I'm not a wash specialist, right? So again, it's to get really specific about where you want to go, and then find those people is going to be your most effective path. Because yeah, most country directors, don't have time to take on 20 mentees, right? And I've got 300 people on my team already. So I've got plenty of people asking me questions. So it's balance out who can help you best get where you want to go. So.
That's great advice. Thank you, Thomas. We've got a couple of questions from the audience around MEAL, monitoring, evaluation, and learning, which I thought was a really good question, because sometimes that's not something that's front of mind when you're thinking about emergency response. So one person has asked, at what point does MEAL come into play? Thomas, I don't know if you'd like to share any insights on that.
Yeah, I mean, that's again impacted by what kind of situation you're talking about. There are different systems for an immediate crisis versus ongoing programs, multi-year grant cycle, et cetera. But in terms of monitoring, evaluation, learning, performance management, all these systems that go into it, and it starts in the same part of the program cycle as everything else. Like, it's the very beginning point. And we actually did have that on a slide on immediate response. Like, you start with planning, monitoring, information management, things that tend to go into that department. But yeah, you're right. It doesn't tend to get front and center review, but there are, like, for those who are interested in that area, it's a great way to enter the industry. It's a great way to look at expatriate positions potentially. And there's even, I think there's like an what's it called? An impact evaluation network, I think it's called. Like, they do a really great job list. They'll send out, like, here's 10,000 jobs on MEAL, and I get that in my inbox every week. So it's an interesting area for sure, particularly for those who like things like data science and who want to be involved with quality assurance and programs.
Great, thank you. Gita, was there anything you would like to add to that? Okay, brilliant. So I'll go to the next group of questions. I'm trying to sort of thematically connect these together. So there's quite a few questions around well-being, and I thought it was really interesting that you both highlighted that and made that very front and center in your presentation. So somebody is asking basically how to, in relation to burnout. So it's Katie Massey. She's asking, it's quite a is a two-pronged question. So I'll ask the first part of it first. Do you think individual organizations do enough to protect the psychosocial needs of humanitarians? And if not, what do you think needs to change on an organizational level? So, Gita, would you like to share any thoughts on that first?
Sure. I don't think organizations do enough. I think there are some that are a little bit ahead of the game compared to others. I think there's a lot of catching up to do with regards to ensuring that teams get the breathing space, are managed right, are not put on a 16-hour cycle where well-being is prioritized as opposed to just reaching impact. And they're both extremely important. And when you're in an emergency, it's difficult to balance the two. So it almost becomes a personal endeavor for you to take care of yourself because the organization is responding to an emergency. And I think that's where sometimes there's a lot of failing, right? Because you're signing a contract with this organization, and you're going to this country with this organization. And to a certain extent, quite a large extent, it is also the organization's responsibility to ensure your well-being. It cannot just be an individual endeavor. So this is all to say that I think we can do more, and I think we can do better. And things are moving in the right direction, but not fast enough. Yeah.
Thanks, Gita. And to look at the second part of Katie's question, I wonder if I could put this to you, Thomas. Katie says, what should change on a systemic sector level to ensure better working conditions for humanitarians? So she's currently doing an MA dissertation on MHPSS for humanitarians. And she says that one piece of research found that 79% of humanitarians experience mental health challenges and 93% attributed it to their job. So we know it's widespread across the sector. So do you have any thoughts on what needs to change on a systemic sector level? Over to you, Thomas.
Yeah, great question. I think getting people like her involved in the industry is a good start. I think that demonstrates there has been a shift in how people are looking at it. I remember like when we first started talking about it, like everyone gave these like, oh, everyone has 8 calls with a psychologist for 45 minutes, and we're done, and that still happens in most agencies. Like that's kind of it, right? And then what also has become industry standard is you have the right to withdraw. It's like, if you feel bad, you can leave. Like, well, yeah, obviously, right? Because you're never enslaved to an organization. Yeah, systemically, I think what's interesting is there are some very good practices in different parts of the humanitarian world, which don't necessarily cross over. For example, on the domestic side of the American Red Cross, we had an amazing volunteer disaster mental health department, right? Every response, every shelter, everything has a standard of psychological first aid and has, counselors available, and it's really just ingrained into the process. And I think when you're looking at level of resourcing and level of capacity, that's where it tends to break down. Like an agency like NRC doesn't have access to that number of volunteers and that number of volunteer counselors, for example. So when we look at systemically changing it, there has to be a system-wide resource, and that's not developed. And I think you do see that somewhat with the UN, and you do see that somewhat with the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, but on the NGO side, that system-wide availability of resources has not yet been developed, and I'm pretty sure eventually it will, because even the tools exist. Like if you look at the Red Cross, Red Crescent, they have tools that could be translated. It's a question of having leadership that acknowledges that, invests into it, and brings it over. So continuing to advocate for it and continuing to do dissertations on the topic is a good start. Thanks.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Thomas. So my next question, staying on the sort of well-being kind of theme, Constantina asks, how easy is it to maintain family work-life balance as an aid worker, especially if you have to travel often? Can you elaborate more on that, please? So could I put this one to you first, Gita?
Sure. I think there are moments when it's difficult and there are moments when you're able to keep it in balance. It really depends on the situation. And I think having and being, I mean, for me, it's also about being able to be open with my children and tell them, look, this is going to be a difficult period. You know, mommy's going to be gone for the next couple of weeks, but then she's going to be back. And, but we need to work on this together as a family. And I think accepting that is important, that it's not going to be 100% work-life balance all the time. There will be periods of intensity, and there will be times when you're like, oh my God, I got this. I don't need to lean in. I can actually do all of this all at once at the same time. And there are times you don't, and that's just part of it. It's just part of the game. It's part of the work. It's what you signed up for. But I think throughout all of that, even the intense periods, keeping it in your line of sight that your mental and physical health is important is critical. Because you can go through an intense period and that's fine, but if you lose that element of yourself, it's going to lead to burnout.
Thanks, Gita. Thomas, is there anything you'd like to add on that?
Well said. And yeah, again, I think some of it is also organizational culture, right? If you work at a place that respects that balance, it'll be easier for you to keep the balance. Some of that in your career is finding a place where you feel like the values match. You know, some people love working, organization X. Some people love working organization Y, and it's finding that spot which will help you in the end. But yeah, I mean, it's tough. My wife and I, we have kids. We've moved around quite a bit. It's always very challenging, particularly when we go to a new duty station, as it's called, right, to a new city. We've been very lucky to not have to split up, but that doesn't mean it won't continue that way. Like I might have to go someplace that they can't come in the future, right? And I have been on 2-month deployments away from my family. It's hard to readjust, reintegrate when you come back. And yeah, that's also a relational thing. You have to have a strong relationship to build on that too. So yeah, not the easiest thing, but I would, I think about, like, I have a friend who's a salesman in the United States and he's on the road 5 days a week. So when I think about a work-life balance, not only us, I think it gets particularly hard when you're dealing with crisis, but it could impact in a lot of different careers. So, over.
Thanks, Thomas. Listening to you both speaking on that point makes me think back to your earlier slides where you're saying that sort of that flexibility and adaptability is so important. So it sounds like that extends to your unit, your family unit as well. So yeah, that's just quite inspiring that you're able to do that as a family. So I've got a couple of questions that link to the theme of sort of a cultural fit within an organisation, so to speak. So an anonymous attendee says, as you've said, every organisation has its problems. If these affect your work and peace of mind, what should you do? Try to change the things that are wrong, or take a step back and look for another work context. So Thomas, could I put that one to you first, please?
Sure. Yeah, it's one of my key learnings for myself over the years is, again, I've worked in a lot of different places, some of the biggest humanitarian agencies globally, and like every single place I've worked has got its own challenges, So finding a place that you are comfortable dealing with challenges or interested in helping fix them, in the best case scenario, really is key to that. But I think if you find yourself in that situation, it depends on what the challenge is, right? You have to realize, like, sometimes managers are not given the tools they need to become good managers, and they can become very, overbearing or rude, or, if you're in a situation where you're like, people are just completely violating the code of conduct, yeah, you need to report up. If you're in a situation where things like maybe could be better, you have to consider how much you're willing to invest into making them better yourself as well. I think tends to be, from where I sit at least, a lot of the challenges in the industry are HR related. People will have challenges with their management, or their challenges with how policies are being implemented or not implemented. And so again, there's a couple different layers there. It's one, if there's like serious violations, those need to be reported and investigated, right? But if it's just kind of like, I don't like the culture, then that really comes back to you. Like, you know, if you can find a place that fits better, you know, why stick around, you know? But if it's challenges that you think, hey, I can contribute positively to this and I'm willing to, then yeah, that will help build out your professionalism, I think, in the long term. That's part of like why I work for NRC at the moment. You know, I think the organizational culture, I enjoy it, and I came back to it after having been away for a few years, and I was glad to be able to come back to it. And I got lucky, you know, with the job offer that I have, and so altogether, you know, the challenges and how the organization is developing and the things that it's looking at are very interesting to me. Questions of leadership, coaching, mentoring, etc. Yeah, yeah. I don't know. It's not very clear cut. Can't say yes or no. Gita?
Thanks, Thomas. Gita, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I think Thomas put it quite well. I mean, again, I've, like Thomas, worked in multiple different organizations, large ones, small ones. And you really just have to find your home agency. And it takes trial and error. And not all of them have the same systems and processes that align with your value system. So it's, yeah, you just have to try it out and move if you're unhappy. Because I think change from within is not always feasible. Over.
Thanks, Gita. So for the next set of questions, I'm going to sort of zoom out a bit and look into sort of factors shaping, securing a role in different contexts. So we have someone who's posted a question. It's quite a long one, but I'll sort of take the liberty of just shortening it for the putting this question to you. So basically, it was really nice how at the start of the presentation that you both really emphasised the importance of gaining local experience with local organisations. Now, this person has said that they've done that volunteering independently in Poland in support of Ukrainians, coordinating transport for Ukrainians to get to the UK, visas, etc. So they have lots and lots of transferable skills, done lots of networking with pop-up response teams and so on. But they're asking if they wonder employers would be put off by the fact that this work was done not under an official, well-recognised NGO, which were noticeably absent on the ground. So I don't know whether, Thomas, you wanted to share any thoughts on that one?
Sure. Yeah, so, you know, there's a handful of NGOs that almost everyone knows and hears about, and then there are thousands that people don't know about. So I think in turn, if your experience is relevant, a hiring manager or recruiter should consider it. I mean, if you had done all that work with like NRC in Poland, people would probably more immediately be like, oh, okay, you know, that's kind of a clicks the checkbox kind of thing. But really, that will come on to you to sell your story to other people. So you should not assume that recruiters will know, you know, the agencies you've worked for in any case. You should always be able to explain in your cover letter, et cetera, like, this is exactly why I'm the best fit for the agency. But also targeting is important, right? Like I get a lot of people who reach out to me on LinkedIn, say, hey, I've been doing something similar to what you're describing. Do you think I'm qualified to be an area manager at NRC? I was like, you know, honestly, no. Like you need to go through several other steps first. And so I think going from where you are and saying, okay, who around you is doing the job that you want to do and how do you get to it, right? And what's the next step from where you are? So maybe from where you are moving into a logistics assistant role with a Ukrainian NGO, you know, maybe that's a good way to go. Maybe moving into, you know, whatever operational position with a smaller European NGO might be a smart thing to do, something like ACF. Not ACF, you know, PIN, Dan Church Aid, et cetera, these types of organizations. And so, yeah, again, it's targeting is really important. And you can figure out some of that from talking to people in the area, which again comes from really just reaching out and trying to get those conversations going. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you, Thomas. Gita, do you have any thoughts on this one?
Nothing to add.
Okay. That's great. So the next question is around skill. Keep staying on the subject of skills. So this is a question from Risa that's specifically for Gita. She says she's also interested in working in the Middle East because she grew up there. And she wants to ask if this is okay if you speak Arabic, and whether it's possible to find work in this specific area without knowing the language.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, deployments happen differently across different agencies. So I know, for example, with the State Department, before they actually send anybody out, they put them through immersive language classes, especially if they're in a political position. But with the nonprofit world, it's a desired qualification usually, but it's not a required qualification. It's always better to be able to speak the local language, or at least try to speak the local language, because it wins you, you generate social capital with it. It's easier to get to know your colleagues. It's easier to make connections, whether you're going for local government meetings or you're meeting ministers at the national level. It is important. Do I speak Arabic? Oh my God, I have tried. I have taken so many classes. And I think with a full-time job and a family, it's about prioritization. It's about seeing, okay, can I do this without the language and knowing it completely? Yes, I can. Do I have enough of a background in the language to actually sit through a meeting and use a bit of non-verbal communication mixed with verbal to understand? Yes, I do. So it's just about a case by case, situation. While in Indonesia, when I went there for the tsunami response, learning the language, because Aceh was so secluded, was actually a higher priority than I would say it has been for me in the Middle East. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. Over.
Thanks, Gita. Thomas, would you like to add anything on language skills?
Yeah, I would just note there are a few places in the world where it is pretty mandatory, right? Like it's very hard to work in West Africa if you don't speak French. Very hard to work in Latin America if you don't speak Spanish. Middle East, since most people speak English, tends to be a bit more fluid. Like Eastern Europe, English has been kind of a dominant operating language. And but yeah, I mean, there are places where you have to speak Portuguese, like Swahili is preferred, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, Latin America and West Africa tend to be the most like, if you don't speak French, you're probably not going to be working in Senegal. Over.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we're almost running out of time in this Q&A session. It's been brilliant to see the fantastic questions coming through from all of you. And thank you, Thomas and Gita, for sharing such great insights with everyone. I think we've got time for just 2 more questions before I take the liberty of wrapping up. Staying on the topic of securing employment, Bernard asks, what do you think is a right path for a youth to choose while trying to grow in leadership, but he or she comes from a less privileged or marginalized areas where even connecting to great people of different professions is hard to get? So it's basically having that access to those connections to grow in a leadership role. Thomas, could I come to you first on that one?
Sure. Yeah, it's a tough one. I get that from people frequently as well. And again, I mean, the only real easy, kind of easy, kind of easy answer is you can do a lot of networking online now. Like LinkedIn is a place that, is pretty solid. There's sessions like this, which are very solid. There are other, like in the US, we have something called the Society for International Development. They host a lot of, online type events, and a lot of countries will have NGO forum that you can engage with as well. But yeah, learning how to engage with people online and to ask for information interviews, 20 minutes just to connect and hear and start building out those friendships is really key, particularly if you're in a remote place without direct access to anyone doing the job that you want to do. But that also means you have to know which job you want to do. That's the first place to start.
Thanks, Thomas. Gita, would you like to add anything?
I mean, just to piggyback a little bit on what Thomas said, I mean, I think with the internet, the world to a certain degree is your oyster. It doesn't make it easy. It's still going to be extremely difficult, but it's also about putting yourself out there and potentially investing. You know, if you have limited funds, the limited funds you have in the right places. So whether that's a specialized training or whether that's getting LinkedIn Premium for 1 month, so you can actually write to people directly and request informational meetings with them, whether that's doing a very short course on, you know, AI and humanitarian aid. But putting the limited funds you have towards the right resources, using the internet and to kind of bring that to the forefront would be, yeah, something that could be helpful. Over.
We add one more point to that. Like I wrote this piece on trying to find your first career. In terms of networking, I mean, if you don't know anyone and you're starting from scratch, you probably realistically, in order to get a few champions, people who will really help you get a job, you're going to be looking at talking and reaching out to hundreds of people, 200-300 people before you can finally build out having those 3, 4, 5 champions who will help you. So it's really a significant investment of your time as opposed to doing 500 job applications, right? So look at the jobs you're interested in, but really spend significant time reaching out to folks, however you can find them.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Gita and Thomas, for all your insights. I think we could probably run 10 of these sessions to ask you all so much more of your views and based on all of your experiences. But sadly, we have to draw this session to a close in a few moments. So I'm just going to take a few minutes to just wrap up and outline next steps. So when this session closes in a few minutes, a Zoom survey should pop up on your screen. So with just 2 quick questions for your feedback. So we'd be most grateful if you share your comments with us. And lots of you have been asking about the slides and the HPass badge. So keep an eye on your inbox. In the next 24 hours, you'll get an email from us with a copy of the slide deck and a link to the recording. And then you'll receive a separate email, probably next week, with regards to your HPass digital badge, which you can claim and to demonstrate your learning engagement in this forum, because this has been a 90-minute session with lots of information. So we provide that badge to demonstrate that you've been here and engaged with us in this space. And then you're very welcome to reply to your email from us to share any general thoughts, reflections, or suggestions for future sessions as well. We'd love to hear your thoughts and ideas. And while we're here, I just want to take this opportunity to highlight a relevant learning resource on our free digital learning platform, Kaya. So we have the acclaimed Field program. So this is a free open access course with multi-modules. So you're able to log in and take the courses at your own pace, and it focuses on developing the knowledge and skills for frontline humanitarian managers. And this course is available in English and Arabic. And a really nice thing is as well is you can claim an HPass digital badge on completion of each module. So again, you can use that to demonstrate your learning, share them on LinkedIn, and it makes a really good discussion point, talking point. And I'm really pleased to say that this is not the last that we've seen of Gita. She'll be returning to our screens next month, and she'll be facilitating a webinar discussion on localization. So we're inviting in 3 brilliant panelists who will be sharing their first-hand experiences and perspectives on localization in practice and what is happening on the ground where they are in the world. So add the date to your diary, 21st of August at the same time, 11 o'clock British Summer Time. So again, I'll include the sign-up link in the post-event email. So please do sign up for that if you're able to. It would be great to welcome you back to this space. And that just leads me to say thank you, a huge thank you to Gita and Thomas for what has been an excellent session, really insightful, really inspiring. I can see that our audience members have really, really engaged with this and got a lot out of you sharing, generously sharing all of your knowledge and pearls of wisdom. So a huge thank you from us. And of course, that leads me to say thank you to all of our audience members joining us from around the world. It's been so lovely to have you all in this space with us today, over 200 of you, and asking such great relevant questions and leaving great comments as well in the chat. So thank you once again. And just keep an eye out for the email from us in the next 24 hours. Thank you so much.